for attending today. So I'm basically going to be covering the survey methodology for the National Plant Monitoring Scheme in this first presentation. And then I believe we're going to have a break, and then I'll be covering the data entry or using on the plant portal after that. And hopefully I should be able to answer any questions that you have as a result. So just to give you a bit of an outline of what we're hoping to cover here in this first session, I'm going to give you a little bit of background about the National Plant Monitoring Scheme and why it was started, because I think it's useful to have a bit of a background on that. Then leading on to the detailed methodology and how to get started with that and how to carry out your surveys from plot selection and creation and doing the survey on the ground. And then I'm going to also show ways that you can get support with all these processes. So the NPMS is a UK-wide citizen science habitat-based plant monitoring scheme that covers the major freshwater and terrestrial semi-natural habitats. The NPMS provides an indication of changes in plant diversity and abundance across the UK's habitats through time and was designed to meet the need for a standardised approach to plant monitoring, which was identified as high priority within the Terrestrial Biodiversity Surveillance Strategy, which was published by JNCC, the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, in 2008. The basis of the NPMS is a national scheme that is across all of the UK with monads or simply 1 kilometre squares that have been randomly designated, and volunteers across the UK can allocate themselves squares. Obviously, it's slightly different with regards to the Chilterns project, but I'll go into more detail about that. Because obviously you've had 50 squares specifically added to the project area. So the National Plant Monitoring Scheme was designed and developed by the BSBI, the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, UKCEH, the Centre of Ecology and Hydrology, and JNCC, the Joint Nature Conservation Committee. JNCC is the public body that advises the UK government and devolved administrations on UK-wide and international nature conservation. They provide a shared scientific nature conservation service for the UK and are a mechanism for pooling resources to obtain evidence and advice on nature conservation and natural capital. The UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology is an independent, not-for-profit research institute carrying out environmental science across land, sea and air. And the BSBI is a botanical society for anyone interested in the flora of Britain and Ireland and has been around since roughly 1836. Recently, we also have a new partner, Northern Irish Partners, DARA, the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs. So they've recently joined us as a partner as well. So the NPMS provides an indication of changes in plant diversity and abundance across the UK's habitats through time, as I mentioned. In the UK, there are already long-standing schemes for monitoring populations of bats, birds. For example, the British Bird Survey, and there's the British Butterfly Monitoring Scheme, for example, but there wasn't a similar scheme for plants. So with major changes taking place and declines in biodiversity across habitats being reported, for example, through habitat change, nutrient enrichment, sort of nitrogen deposition, climate change and so on, it became crucial to have a better understanding of plant populations. There was and still is need for a large-scale coverage and systematic approach. Otherwise, there's the potential to sort of mask trends and weaken the signals that you can find. So the 4 partners mentioned came together in 2012 to devise the scheme and the methodologies before a pilot was then run in 2014. And after that pilot in 2015, the National Plant Monitoring Scheme as a whole was launched. So making 2021 the 7th year the scheme has run and data collected. Last year was a really pivotal year for the scheme, which is obviously bad timing with the lockdown and everything, but we've now finally had enough data because you needed 5 years worth of data to look at the trends and the indicators. Sorry, my slide suddenly stopped working. Bear with me. Right, okay. So as I've said, there was no robust survey for plants already in existence, and so there was a real need to establish the scheme. And this needed to include semi-natural habitats that were beyond just protected sites. So looking at what the data can tell us in the future, the scheme's aims are to provide habitat inventories and to contribute to remote sensing. The aims also include investigating drivers of change using MPMS data, considering, for example, climate change, habitat management, invasive species, pollution and eutrophication, coastal management, pests and pathogens, protected areas, and animal-plant interactions, for example. So just a few little facts and figures for you. So in total, there are 408 MPMS species. There are 11 broad habitats and 28 fine habitats. We've got 5 partners. We recommend 5 plots per square, but it's worth remembering that most people on average do, I think it's 4 plots per square. There's the 3 different recording levels, 2 visits per year to your plot, and currently we have just over 1,500 volunteers as part of the national scheme. So this is a little infographic that was designed as part of celebrating the 5 years of the MPMS. So some of the numbers are now out of date. For example, that we have more volunteers than that now. But the slide really highlights the dedication of all the volunteers, as in 5 years they managed to return 876 monads with data and surveyed 3,977 individual plots, which is pretty incredible. So as I said, last year was quite a pivotal year, because one of the unique things about the MPMS is that monitoring MPMS habitat plots twice a year, every year, provides an unparalleled opportunity to track and understand the responses of plants to our changing environment, and it allows us to investigate the growing pressures on our environment from all the drivers of change that I mentioned before. So with the 5th season of surveys finally finished last year, they then was able to sort of really look at the data, and this report, Understanding the Health of Our Habitats, was released in March last year. So the full report is on the MPMS website, so you can go and have a look at that in more detail if you want to see.
Sarah, just quick questions coming on the chat before you leave a couple of slides ago.
Yep.
Could you explain what eutrophication is?
Oh, yeah, of course. Sorry,
someone's put
me
it
with
up
my
there.
science words.
I think I can spell it, but that's cool. Yeah.
So eutrophication is mostly referring to bodies of fresh water where perhaps there's been runoff from fertilizer or other nutrients that then basically create a sort of unnatural levels of nutrient deposition within that freshwater body. That in turn allows things like algae to bloom and to absolutely go wild. Then as the algae basically breaks down and rots, where with bacteria, sort of anaerobic bacteria basically breaking it down, there's like a whole cycle of where the anaerobic bacteria are using up, there's like basically the sunlight can't get into the water, and then plants can't grow, and the whole thing just becomes a bit of a rotting pile of, not good. If that was from my science degree days, but yeah, that's basically what it means.
Thanks, Sarah.
No worries. So yes, so another major achievement last year, which you may have heard mentioned last year with Rachel, is the experimental indicator that was released. So during the end of last year, DEFRA and the JNCC released their UK biodiversity indicators. These provide an annual view of how a variety of groups of wildlife and other indicators of action for biodiversity conservation have fared across the UK in recent years. So 2020 was a landmark year for MPMS volunteers because it marked the first ever contribution of MPMS data to a national biodiversity indicator. So specifically, MPMS data from 4 of the scheme's best surveyed broad habitats, which I'll go into a bit more in a minute, have been used to create a new indicator category, which is titled C7 Plants of the Wider Countryside. So the indicator is still classified as experimental, which just means it hasn't been probably tested enough times to sort of see if it's robust enough at this point. But however, getting to that point in only 6 years of field surveys really highlights the incredible dedication of the volunteers who survey for us, and just the wealth of data that comes in, really. So therefore, heading into the 7th year, there is now huge potential for future analysis to show change in plant communities over time. So just released the other day was a little video that I produced about the indicator. And this is a little infographic that I had made earlier in the year, just to demonstrate exactly what what that means a bit, because sometimes we can throw these terminologies around and sometimes we're not quite sure what that actually means. So as I said, it's those 4 habitats: arable field margins, bog and wet heath, broadleaf woodland and hedges, and lowland grassland were the ones that were included in that indicator. And at the moment, it's sort of showing sometimes a bit of a decline and then an increase, but the point is it's showing change over time, which with more and more data as it comes in, we'll be able to use these indicators to really measure the effects of things that are causing change in our community, plant communities.
Yeah. So just coming on to jump in, just put
Yep.
tracking the impact in context, and again, so are you kind of essentially saying 5 years, or the 7 years, sorry, is essentially the minimum, really? You could say you've got
5 years, yeah.
5 is the minimum you can get a robust baseline essentially to move on. So in context of tracking the impact, if we say last year was kind of half of the first year, this is year 1 of achieving our first 5 years of what hopefully will be a longer term piece of work. Yeah, great. Thank you.
I'll go into more details. I think I can't remember if it's in this presentation or the next one about how the tracking the impact project and how you can compare that to the national data set and how useful that is.
Great.
So again, obviously at this point, I'm still just talking about the national scheme. So as you can see on the map, this is where the all the 1 kilometre monads are placed. So they're either orange or blue, which means, so if they're blue, it means that they're currently unallocated to a volunteer. And if they're orange, it means they've already been allocated. So in total, I think we've got 1,756 squares allocated. So some volunteers do take on more than 1 square. Some are super keen, but we try to limit people to five squares. So there's still quite a lot of work to be done in some of the more sort of northern regions of Scotland, the Highlands. Typically, a lot of those blue areas tend to sort of coincide with where there's maybe slightly difficult to access places. So we're working with Mountain Training Association and national parks, etc. But as you can see, this is the sort of general spread of the national scheme, which obviously, again, you can see there's quite a lot of uptake of squares that are near where people live, which is understandable, but that bias is usually taken into account when we're looking at the data as well. So with regards to looking at tracking the impact project, specifically things are a little bit different in terms of the data and the squares. So one of the things about the project is that it is utilising the MPMS methodology, which is future-proofing the scheme, because the MPMS methodology is getting national recognition, and in terms of its robustness and relative ease of use for monitoring with the 3 skill levels at entry point. So basically, by taking on this methodology for the tracking the impact, you're making sure that your project is going to be really robust, and you can use that data and sort of align it with the national data set in the future as well. So this is just to show you obviously where all the squares are for the project. So yeah, if the project basically was to use the existing randomly selected 1 kilometre squares that are in the national project, that would have been only a handful of squares over the area. So because the project wants to look at the long-term monitoring, specifically within the Chilterns AONB, with more squares were needed really for the scheme. So with the core MPMS scheme, we cannot just add additional squares wherever we want, as this affects the bias on the data in terms of looking at it at a national level. Therefore, the Tracking the Impact project has created 51 kilometre squares and adopted the MPMS methodology, but the data doesn't go into the national data set. However, one great thing about this is that the data can be extracted and then compared to the national data set and against national trends. So just to revisit, the aim of the national scheme and at project level is to provide reliable measures of change for individual species and species groups within semi-natural habitats, and to use both positive and negative indicator species for each habitat. So the species that were included in the scheme were chosen to be reliable indicators, species which are widespread and are relatively easy to identify. So as I have said, the survey design needed to be straightforward, repeatable and achievable by volunteers. So just to look at sort of the basics really. So you get your allocated 1 kilometre square and you create your plots in hopefully different MPMS habitats. Surveyors then record the abundance of indicator species and any other background information. So this survey is then carried out twice a year, every year, once in late spring, early summer, and then once in late summer. So that's just an overview. We're obviously going to go into a lot more detail. So once, as a volunteer, once you've requested and been allocated your square, you then hopefully from Nick, as I've been told, will receive the welcome pack with all the survey guidance notes, species ID guide, species and habitat lists, survey forms, and a map of your 1 kilometre square. So the ID guidebook was specifically created for the scheme and is compact and concise, organised in flower colour. However, volunteers can and do supplement with their own ID books of choice. The guidance notes explains the details of the methodology, and the species lists show which species are to be recorded for each habitat dependent on surveyor level. So you can also see the recording forms tucked behind there, which once used in the field can then be used for uploading the data onto the plant portal. Have you got any questions about the equipment at all there, Nick? Just sort of...
No, just a quick one there, just to follow up, Sarah. I was waiting for today before I sent all the resources out. So after today, I'll follow up so everything kind of will make sense and be in context, having heard from today. So early next week, I'll send those out to you. So you've got the list of indicator species and you have all the instructions. So
yeah, okay. Well, I'll show the inside of the species list and the recording forms on some of the slides in a little bit more detail.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah.
So one of the things that we recommend is a reconnaissance visit to your square to identify NPMS habitats and establish your plots and record your plot locations so that they can be relocated next time. So it's worth checking that there aren't previously allocated plots in your square. Now, this might be more relevant maybe going forward with the project if somebody's taken on a square, set up some plots, and then perhaps they, for some reason, they're no longer involved in the project. Because that's something that obviously we get as part of the national scheme. Somebody will take up a square, create these plots, and then for whatever reason, like maybe they've moved, they then leave the square and somebody else takes it up. And we always say it's always worth checking that somebody hasn't done all that hard work creating the plots for you before you then sort of go and set up your own.
Yeah, but for us, because we're starting out from scratch, there will be fresh squares. Now, some of the squares will be set up from last year. So no, Jan and one or two others on the call, you set your squares up last year, so you'll repeat that. Yeah. But for most of the people on the
they'll be setting up.
We'll be setting up from scratch.
Yeah. So as I say, that might be something that comes up later that's worth bearing in mind with new volunteers coming on.
When we come. Yeah, no, I can do that. Lynette, you've got your hand up as well. Did you ask a question?
It's the same one that I put in the chat, which is because I've got a BTO bird square around Oxfordshire. I'm not part of the Chilterns tracking the impact anymore because I was looking for a square where I could just visit quite a lot during the year and get to know and do the plant ID as well as the bird project. So I was wondering if it's okay for me to do the plant ID work in that BTO bird square. I mean, it's land, I suppose, if that's all right, or would I have to be allocated a square?
Yeah, so did you say it's outside of the Tracking the Impact project?
Yeah, it's a BTO square. The BTO rep in Oxfordshire gave it to me.
Okay, well, I mean, by all means, if you're going to record any plant data, that's fine, and you can send it in via your local botanical recorder or using the iRecord app. But if we're looking at specific national plant monitoring scheme, then because of the robustness of the methodology, we can't just allow people to record in any square that they want. It has to be one of the ones that's as part of the scheme. So by all means, you can have a look on the NPMS website and see if there is a square nearby, but I mean, the likelihood of it matching up exactly with your BTO square is quite unlikely.
It doesn't have to, yeah. It's more that it's easier to get to. You see, I don't really want above 40 minutes drive and back, so I'm less likely to go there regularly, really, and I'd like to get to know the patch. So I'm quite happy to look and see if there's anything in the area.
Yeah, I mean, by all means, have a look on the website. There's a section that says squares near me. And you can get like within a sort of 10 mile or whatever or less 5 mile radius of where you are, you can then see where there's a square, and if it's one that's unallocated, you can allocate it to yourself, and then we just approve it for you. So that's
Great. That sounds really simple. Thank
okay.
you.
All right. So as I was saying, yeah, we recommend that you do a bit of a reconnaissance visit to your square. And we currently advise, obviously with us being in the lockdown situation, that square reconnaissance should really only be done where it's really local to you and part of your normal daily exercise, or and you can maintain social distancing. Obviously, these things are changing and evolving as we speak, with things kind of moving forward in the next month or so. But most importantly, here at the NPMS, and I'm sure Nick agrees, that in no way do we ever want volunteers to put themselves at any risk. So do what feels comfortable with you. However, if you're following footpaths or lanes or using OS map, you can start to get a picture of what your square is like and who might own parts of it too, and what access is like and where NPMS habitat is or extends to. So once that you've had your square allocated, you can have a look online at some of the sort of Google Maps type situation. And maybe you've done your square recce, but then you need to start considering the landowner permission side of things. So survey dates then just need to be agreed with the landowners as required if they need it. Obviously, if you found that you can set up a plot that's right next to a public footpath, then that's fine. But you still might need to be aware that sometimes with regards to public footpaths, I think the technical rule is that you're not supposed to step off the path. So setting up a plot might get some people sort of interested in what you're doing. So sometimes it is worth finding out who owns areas of land. So I'm currently working on a few ways that we can get that you can get help with the landowner permission side of things, including on a video on how to find out who might own a site, where to find the letter on the website that you can download. But as you can see here, we have a few tips, including Google Maps, which is my personal favorite. Or, is it owned by the council or a national park or national trust or local wildlife trust? So as I said, on the website, there's a permission letter and a thank you letter that you can download and put your own details in. And when I say on here, keep the landowner information, obviously for reasons of GDPR, you can't then share them unless maybe they're publicly available anyway. So you found it on Google Maps and it's an address that's already located on there. But I mean, sometimes it literally comes down to the case of you've got the letter that sort of explains what the project is. It's come from us or from Nick or something, and you just put it in through some doors and see where you get with that.
Sarah, sorry to keep jumping. I guess it's probably relevant at this stage. So from our perspective, we don't know every single landowner in the Chilterns as much as we'd like to. And much as I'd also love to be able to negotiate access for you, that's probably going to struggle. But where we do have coverage, say from where our farms in our farm cluster, we do have quite a growing kind of database of landowners that we're working with, where I can help negotiate landowner access for you, where we've got those links. So if you're struggling, let me know, and it may well be that your square kind of fits over one of our farms or one of the other sections, and we can help out. And we probably can with our RPA database at least give you contact details for the farms in your or the landowners in your square. So we can pick that up offline here, but I can probably help in some cases as well.
Yep. Yeah, no, that's useful. I mean, we always say to our national volunteers as well, is that if they're struggling with landowners stuff, then they contact us, and usually I can, have a lot. My previous role in my other job, I had to get landowner permissions a lot, so I'm kind of used to this as well. So just going back into the sort of methodology of like your plots, for example. So the main points to consider when you're thinking about your plots are that we suggest that you have 3 square plots, maybe 5 by 5 meter, and 2 linear, so 1 by 25 meter plots. So there are pre-selected plot locations, I believe, on the maps that you're given, and those are recommended because then it avoids the site selection bias side of things. I'll come on to the pre-selected plots in a moment. But surveys should really only be carried out in NPMS habitats, and ideally each plot should be located in a different habitat. This is, however, difficult if A, your square has no apparent NPMS habitat on it, or B, the whole square is only one NPMS habitat type. In these cases, firstly, the mapping data that we've used to generate where NPMS habitat data is can be inaccurate and not give a true representation of what is on the ground. Therefore, don't assume that there isn't any And this is why going for your square recce is useful, as well as looking on Google Maps. If you only have one MPMS habitat type, for example, some of the squares that we give out nationally are just completely heathland, then you'll only be able to record in that habitat type, obviously. But what we are asking is, where possible, choose different habitat types. So on average, across all scheme monads, around 4 plots are surveyed per kilometre square. Therefore, do not panic if you can't find 5 suitable plots or even 4. The reasons for all these rules and apparent strict regulations and everything is that by following the guidance as well as you can, it aims to reduce bias to ensure that the data is statistically robust. So just to give you a little brief overview of how 5 survey plots are selected within the monads. So square maps provided to each volunteer might look a bit like this. The pre-selected numbered plot locations are randomized, but the 1 kilometre grid squares are usually selected with a bias towards those with MPMS habitat in them. If possible, it is recommended that you use these numbered plot locations, as I mentioned. But as you can imagine, if we were always able to choose our exact plot locations, we may very well end up choosing the rather nice patch of orchids in the corner of the grassland. And as lovely as this would be, if you scale it up on a project level or nationally, this would give a misrepresentation of what is really happening in our habitats. So if your plot is boring, we understand that this can be frustrating, but this is why we go on walks to nature reserves and maybe send in our records to iRecord or to our BSBI recorder, because these sometimes boring MPMS plots are how we are measuring the health of our habitats, and so it's vitally important. In the guidance notes, you'll also see a section on Protocol A, which is regarding self-selecting plots. This can be done if there are reasons why you cannot use the numbered ones due to factors like safety, access, where MPMS habitat is, for example. Protocol A suggests that you locate your plot in MPMS habitat that you can find, but more specifically in an area of the habitat that matches the average, typical or representative portion of that habitat. So if you were to self-select a plot, say in a grassland, and you look across the whole site and it's pretty much all dominated by the same sort of few species, then you want to kind of set your plot up in a part that represents that, rather than maybe the corner that's full of the orchids or the corner that's near the gate, which has got sort of some early pioneer species, that sort of thing, because that's not going to be truly representative of the rest of that habitat type.
Sarah, can we just go back? You may come on to this actually, so shout if you are, but because I think this came up quite a bit last year when we were setting plots up. So on one hand, I think the guidance is saying pick the priority habitats, so the areas that are coloured in on your square you've shown here.
Yep.
So, and on the other hand, you're saying don't bias it towards those. So would you essentially, on this square, would you try and set up a plot at 9, 8 and 12?
So this is this square is it's quite loaded with MPMS habitats.
Yeah, it's got lots of good habitat in it,
which is great. So yeah, ideally you'd probably want you'd want number 8. You'd probably want, maybe just for the sake of argument, 17 for another square one. And I'd probably, if it was me, I'd probably self-select one for 3 down in some of the heathland area down there.
Right.
And maybe the acid grassland, because it's near enough to 3.
Okay.
And then what I'll get into in a minute is then the linear ones, you ideally want them, the ones that are on the grid lines themselves. Again, I'll go into more details on that in a second.
Okay, but you wouldn't go for 9 and 12?
9 and
12. Because they're in the, what are they in? They're in rough grassland, so they're in one of the priority habitats, but...
Yeah, you could go for those.
You would go with those, okay.
Yeah. So what I was trying to explain is, if, say, for example, this map that you had didn't have any of this lovely colouring in on it, which I have a map that has no colouring in on it. But you were looking at, say, Google Earth, because I've helped quite a few of our volunteers just by using Google Earth to see where I can see from the ground roughly where there's going to be some interesting MPMS habitat. And say up here above 14, there was a patch of what I would consider looks like, I don't know, a bit of rough grassland, for example. Obviously, again, you'd need to do a square reconnaissance to go and actually see it on the ground. But I would probably say that at that point, you want to select a plot in the middle of that grassland. But again, it's finding the most representative plot location within that grassland. So although you're self-selecting the plot, you're not going to select the bit that's got the nicest species in it. By all means, while you're there, if there is a patch of orchids in the corner, record them, send them off to iRecord. It's useful information, but perhaps it's not the most representative part of that habitat to set up your plot, if that makes sense.
Got you. Yeah, thank you.
No worries. So this grid plan crib sheet can be downloaded off the NPMS website. It's under resources. So it helps you to show how to locate your numbered plots. So by using the numbers along each side and the number ID for your square, you can then get an accurate grid reference for that plot location, which then using either, if you're lucky enough to have a GPS device, or more like me, an app on your phone where you can find a grid reference, you can then locate that numbered plot on the ground. Bearing in mind that sometimes this can be variable in accuracy, sort of within 3 meters or more, depending on whether you're using a GPS device or your phone. But this is basically how you would find those numbered plot locations. And perhaps you're doing that in your square recce. So you'd quite like to see, well, does number 13 fall, you know, in an area that I can set up a plot, for example. So I need to find number 13. Okay, so I'm going to look along here and I'm going to get the numbers, and that's going to give me the exact grid reference to find number 13 while I'm out on the ground. Hopefully that makes sense. Do you think that makes sense, Nick?
It's more important that it makes sense to everyone else rather than me, because I'm not going to be doing it. But
okay, well, I'm happy to further explain that if need be.
Shall we? I guess there will be. There are a couple of questions that have popped up in the chat at the moment. Do you want to pick up on questions on this now while we're here, or hang on?
Yeah, we can do. Yeah.
Okay, so there's a couple that have come in. Colin, actually, it might be easier if you want to unmute yourself, Colin, rather than me read your question out. If you want to ask your question, really, because you've asked two, one about permissive access and one around other habitats. So, Colin, if you can hear me, do you want to ask your question direct to Sarah?
Okay, I hope everybody can hear me.
Yeah, got you. Yeah,
I'm not an accomplished Zoom user, so anyway, yeah, I've got a couple of issues. I've got a square where probably 2/3 of the land is some kind of estate, for want of a better word, about 1/3 of which is behind a security fence, and it's proving very difficult to track down somebody who can give me permission to access the bit I can get on.
I see.
And there are 1 or 2 signs up in the sort of area that I've looked at which say this is permissive land, you know, paraphrase. Is it all right actually if I proceed with that on the basis that my understanding is that it's a permissive area, and there's lots of tracks for dog walkers and you see lots of people out and about? So it's really a question of, you know, how far do you have to go to try and an official letter with a yes, you can attend on it?
Yeah, thank you, Colin. That's a good question. I mean, I guess if you found signage that suggests that the area that you want to set up your plot is permissive land, then I'm sure that you could argue that you've made all reasonable attempts to you know, get the permission, and it says it's permissive land. If, however, you would feel better about getting actual permission from the landowner, but you don't know who the landowner is, I mean, it's possible that, I don't know, Nick, have you got any avenues where you could potentially look into finding out? I know if it was one of our national volunteers at this point, I might say, okay, well, I'm going to quickly look on Land Registry for you, and then I can give you a definitive. It's really, yeah, where you feel that you would want to go in terms of support with that, Nick.
Yeah, so our 2 options that we have available to us, one of which is, and I'd need to look into, I can't remember which square you've got now, Colin, but I'll look into it.
It's called Chalfont Grove.
It's Chalfont, yeah. So I need to overlook and see if it overlays with any of the farmers in our cluster, of which there are 18. Then basically they'd all be happy for you to go. I just need to let them know you'll be coming, so that will be okay. And the second avenue, we have access to the RPA database, so I could probably look on there and let you know, assuming our permissions allow, let you know who your landers are. So there's a couple of ways we might be able to help, Colin, basically.
Okay.
So maybe
perhaps we can take
We'll pick that up.
It's
Pick it up.
offline.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We'll pick it up next week. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, and then the other query I had was coming back to habitat types.
Yep.
I've got habitat mark, woodland and hedgerow. So
Yep.
I can choose or more habitats from those. There's a question over then, so the woodland, quite a lot of it is actually deciduous plantation, fairly young, and the rest of it is secondary woodland, so kind of fairly rubbish understories. You know, do I actually choose something which has got a bit of an understory, even though it might be a little bit selective, or do I just go for the bare ground, which is a significant part of the square,
and see if you can find a plant? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean,
yeah.
I would say, so first of all, the broad-leaved woodland broad habitat category includes any newly planted deciduous woods, so that's absolutely fine. In terms of where to select your plot within that woodland, I mean, I would get the grid map like I've got on the screen now and see if one of those numbered plots falls within that broad-leaved planted woodland, and go with that numbered plot first, even if that means you're in the most boring bit ever, because that is just going to give you the most robust data. But equally, while you're there, if you find some nice plants, put them into iRecord or whatever, you know, and enjoy your time there. Like, what we've all got to try and remember is that even if we're given a boring plot to survey, it doesn't mean that you can't enjoy the walk there and back and enjoy the plants that are nearby. It just means that you're looking at this as a scientist, and you're trying to feed the right information back for the data that is there. In
a way, that's what I'm trying to get at, is the overall purpose, so I know sort of on what basis to choose the So then there was a sort of second part of that, which is quite a bit of this site is also what I've loosely, well, could be rough grassland at its best. I don't know whether it's neutral pasture or
the fine habitat.
The fine habitat type. Can I just sort of monitor it as a lowland grassland to start with, and then sort of, if I get some better information as a result of the work, actually allocate it to one or other of the habitat types?
Yeah, if I remember, because with the national scheme entering the data, I believe on the website you don't have to go into fine habitat category if you don't know it. So, for example, you can record it just as lowland grassland. However, from having a look at the plant portal, I think it might require you to go down to the fine habitat scale. So that's something maybe we look at later. In which case, then you're probably going to need to take some more advice into which fine habitat maybe you're looking at. I would say if it's rough grassland and maybe it's dominated by false oak grass, for example, which is a common rank grassland sort of species, then you'll probably be going down to the neutral pastures and meadows, because obviously dry acid grassland, it's pretty obvious when you've got that. Same with calcareous. And obviously neutral damp, you know, there's going to be other indicator species that will give you the idea that it's a damp grassland. So really, if you can eliminate those three, then you're left with the final one, which is just neutral pastures and meadows, and then you can have that as your fine habitat, which is what it sounds like.
Kind of was my guess, but it is fairly rank, you know, grassland, tough, very tussocky. You know,
but and again, if you put that down as the fine habitat, you'll then have your list of species to record for that fine habitat. And I don't know, what are you recording at indicator level, Colin, or
whatever the middle one is? I can't.
Yes, indicator.
Indicator. That was the intention.
You might find that there aren't that many species to record because it's not in good condition, but that is important data nonetheless. And it might be then, if you continue to record that plot location over the next few years, either it suddenly its management has been changed because it's been taken on, and that species will recover, or maybe it will be getting progressively worse. But that is the data that we're looking at. It's that change in plant communities over time. So hopefully that helps.
Okay, thank you very much indeed.
No worries.
Is anybody else while we're here? I'm conscious quite a few of you probably haven't started on this yet, but I know Jan and others, you had a go at this last year. Any other questions while we're on this theme? Because it did come out quite strongly last year's feedback as a bit to kind of to work through. But anybody else while we're here, any questions on this bit?
Otherwise, Nick, happy to have a after this presentation, happy to have a big question and answer session.
Yeah, we can open it out. Yeah,
Yeah.
okay, okay, good stuff. Let's go on. Okay, thanks.
Okay, no worries. Right, so basically going back to plot creation and setup. So whilst on your site, you want to use fixed landmarks to record the plot location and set up only temporary markers. You don't want to leave anything behind. Then you record GPS or the grid reference, make a plot sketch with a written description, and it's useful then to take an annual photograph from the same point or angles. Again, I'm going in more detail in a minute on these things. Linear plots can be along an arable field margin or hedgerow or watercourse. Woodland plots are larger at 10 by 10 meters. This plot setup is done on the Plant Portal website after you've maybe gone and checked out your square. And once it's done in the first year, then it's set up and ready to be simply surveyed twice a year, every year. So there's lots of support and guidance on this stage with YouTube videos guiding people through it. And this year we'll be expanding that with a mini series to aid people in the methodology of plot creation out in the field as well. So laying out your survey plots, basically. So some linear plots are not straight. So just to illustrate that, it's obviously if you're going to be following the line of a hedge or a watercourse, then it's going to be potentially windy or different. So physically laying out your plots can seem a bit of a daunting task initially. However, a few tips to be aware of, hopefully now will help. So regarding locating the number of plots, as we said, we've gone into that with that grid sheet. So hopefully you're at the point with where that numbered plot location is. And before you set off, it's really useful to have a length of cord or string or several tied together with markers at each 5 meter length, plus maybe bamboo canes or tent pegs, for example, to place in the corners of your square to be removed afterwards. Again, I'm going to go into more detail in that. We recommend positioning your plot so that it's parallel to a fence or path or hedge or line or something similar, so that the orientation will help you to reposition when you come for your following visit. Because obviously if you imagine that you set up your plot at a bit of an angle somehow, it's going to be hard to remember exactly what angle and position that you had that in the first case. So if there is a line of trees or a hedge or a path, you can have it so it's the same sort of parallel to that. That will be helpful later on. Then using the cord or the rope, align the first side of the square. Then you use a clipboard or a book to create a right angle in the corner, and then you lay out the next side, putting your corner markers in as you go. Once you've completed this part, you're then able to record your grid reference location in the southwest corner of the plot, take a photo from this position, and make a quick sketch as well. So let's go into a bit more detail on plots. So this is my kit, as you can see. So I have my trusty Weatherwriter clipboard that only has some degree of mold from all my plant specimens that I've stuffed into it over the years. I have my marked bamboo canes that I'm actually reusing after they were used for marking out wildflower seedlings planted on the bank next to the school. I simply tore up some scraps of fabric to make flags for the top of them. I then use the ball of yarn or whatever you have available. And if you can either use pre-measured yarn at 5 meter intervals, as I said, so one for each side, or 10 meters if you're doing woodland. And you can mark that interval, say, with another scrap of fabric tied around. But equally, you can measure once you're on site. So if you've got a tape measure to hand that can measure that, that's great. So this is sort of your plot setup kit, really. So using your little kit, you'll want to place an initial marker in and then measure the first side of your square with the pre-measured string tape or tape measure, or you can paste it out. So if we've forgotten to pre-measure our string or we haven't got a tape measure that's the right length, then by all means you can pace out the 5 meters. the clipboard is then used to create that 90-degree angle at each corner. So you don't end up with basically you could end up with a parallelogram at the end if you don't actually measure out the 90-degree angle. And then, as I said, it's a case of when you're in the southwest corner that you take your photo, get your grid reference and draw your sketch. For some reason, it takes a minute to go on ahead. So just to show you what it really looks like, this was my garden for now, hence the short turf, but hopefully this is useful to see in more detail. However, I am working on a video series on all of this, so you can see somebody setting it up sort of in the live, if you will, that will be on our YouTube channel. But as you can see, I've got my markers in each corner, I've got my yarn, we've either pasted it out or measured, set it up in each corner and then using the clipboard to get that angle. And as you can see at the end, I've got a lovely measured out 5 by 5 meter plot. So most linear plots are 1 by 25 meters for mostly arable field margins, standing and running water. So that includes ponds, rock outcrops, screes, road verges and hedgerows. So ideally, you want the linear plots to cover the part of the feature that intersects with one of those internal boundary grid lines on your 1 kilometre square map. So that means when we were looking at that pre-numbered grid square, it's the numbers that are on the actual lines. Those are the ones that you want to try and set up as your linear features, with the idea that the linear feature is crossed by that grid line. And your plot should start at the point where the feature intersects from the grid line, but then you can go in any direction from there. And you want to use 2 markers to establish the 1 meter width. And then again, you want to use your yarn, your cord, your rope, or a tape measure, or paste it out for the 25 meters in length, and then mark it out again at the other end. If you have a GPS device or you have your phone with the GPS app on it, then you want to record the start and the finishing grid references and take photos from the outside of the plot showing the surroundings. If the linear feature is shorter than the 25 meters, then just record the entirety of it and then make sure you note down exactly what length it is. There are separate sections in the guidance note on linear features for vertical plots, such as rock outcrops, cliff bases or screes, but I don't think these are terribly common. And again, there are further details about linear field margins in the guidance notes regarding which arable crops are not to be recorded, like biofuel crops. And as you can see on the diagram, it's the naturally occurring field margin we are interested in, not the sown areas for bird food, wildflowers, etc. And with regards to the hedgerows, it'll be from 1 meters from the center of the hedgerow. So if you imagine you have your hedgerow and there's a fence right down the middle of it, if you imagine that that's there, it's from that fence point 1 meter out from there. So that is including all of the hedgerow species that are actually the woody species, so your hawthorns, your blackthorns, the standing trees perhaps, and any of the associated ground flora maybe that's intermixed, but not necessarily the grassy edge that's associated with the hedgerow. It's the hedgerow itself that we're looking to record. So just to recap, so you've done your square recce, you have your landowner permissions for the area that you need it, and you've chosen which plots that you want to use, and you've successfully located your chosen plot locations and set them up, recorded them with the grid reference for each of them. You've got a sketch map and a photo, and then you can do all of this before a survey, so during your square recce, or maybe you go out again to set up your plots. Or you could set all of this up before you're about to do your first survey, but you have to remember that once you're back at the computer, you'll need to set up your plots on the plant portal first before you can just start entering the plant data. So whichever is easiest, it's up to you. But as you can see from the form, this has a section for your sketch map and the grid reference for each of your plots. So each volunteer, prior to recording the actual species in the field, needs to decide which level that they wish to survey at. So all of the forms can be used for any of the survey levels. They're all set up the same. So wildflower level, which is the sort of entry level, there's, I think, 212 easily identifiable species divided into lists applicable for each habitat. So about 10 to 15 species per habitat. Indicator level, the middle one, is an expanded list of 408 species divided into groups applicable for habitats, including some species which are a little more challenging to identify, so grasses, sedges, ferns, etc. And there's usually about 30 species per habitat. Whereas then there's the final top level inventory, which is designed for volunteers who are capable of recording all vascular plant species that they find in a habitat. And that includes any that aren't in flower as well. So wildflower is the relatively simpler level in that there's the reduced list. So if we look at, for example, dry deciduous woodland, which is a fine habitat, that has 20 species that need to be recorded at wildflower level. So these include species such as wild garlic, hazel, cleavers, ivy, holly, etc. Whereas at indicator level, there's an expanded list of species for this habitat to record. So for example, 30 in dry deciduous woodland, and that has the additions of species such as wood sedge, wood millet, wood speedwell, for example. And then inventory level is recording all species that are present within the plot. So as I've mentioned, we've got 28 fine MPMS habitats across 11 of the broad habitat categories. So you need to ID the fine habitat if possible, as we just talked about with Colin, and 30 indicator species per habitat selected at a range of positive and negative indicator species. So we have got some non-native species included in the scheme, and they are a useful way of seeing the effects of some non-invasive species. So non-native invasive species, apologies. Species selected on the area based on the compromise between their reliability as positive or negative indicators and also how widespread they are and how easy they are to identify. And that's why we've selected the species that are in it. So sometimes people do query some of the indicator species that are in some of the habitats, but they've had to look at so many different factors as to which ones they choose for which habitat type. So you may want to record other species and this information is still useful, but it won't be used to assess the change in the habitat quality.
And so just to pick up, sorry, on this bit here particularly. So I think it came out last year. Is it okay if someone comes in, say, at the wildflower level? And then in a couple of years' time, become more confident with ID or fancy giving the indicator a go? Is that okay to sort of essentially scale up?
Oh yeah, that's encouraged.
Yeah, so that doesn't skew your data or anything. No, so it may well be. Yeah, so it could easily start off at wildflower when you get your confidence, then up to indicator if, okay.
Equally, the other way around, if you start in at indicator and then suddenly go, oh, cripes, actually, I'm not sure that I'm ready for this yet. The following year, you can go back down to wildflower level and get a bit more comfortable and move back up when you feel ready. So brilliant. Absolutely.
Thanks.
So this is the survey guidance notes, which you should hopefully be receiving, which has a list of all of the broad scale and fine habitat in there, which has a little mini description about each habitat type, what's included, what's not, and some images and things like that. So just to go into a little bit more about the habitat. So as we said, we have broadleaf woodland, which has got the dry deciduous woodland, which is the majority of our UK native woodlands. So it might be a beech dominated woodland or oak and ash or something like that. We've got hedgerows of native species, so that's fairly obvious when you've got one of those. What the reason it's saying native species is obviously if you're looking at a recently planted cotoneaster hedge or something, that's not obviously MPMS habitat, and we don't want to include that. And then we've got wet woodland, which are normally dominated by alders and willows, for example, and there's a description in the guidance notes again about those. We've then got native pinewood and juniper scrub, which obviously when we're looking at native pinewood, we're talking up in Scotland with the native Scots pine woodlands, and juniper scrub is not even a habitat that I've ever really come across myself, so a little bit more difficult to identify here. Arable field margins, however, we all know those. That in fact doesn't even get split down into any fine habitat, so it's a single broad habitat on its own. But as I mentioned, it would be the species that are associated with the actual arable field, nothing that's actually planted in as a sort of wild bird resource, for example. So lowland grassland can be one of the more difficult ones, as we were talking about with Colin. So initially you can stand there in a field and go, oh, I've no idea what this is. But again, the list of species should give you an indication for all the splitting them up into the different ones. We are also having a lot more training this year on these habitat types. So do come along to that. They're webinar styles, so up to 500 people per session. We've got Dominic Price from the Species Recovery Trust, who's going to be detailing these different grassland types for us. Then we've got upland grassland, which is obviously mountainous regions. Heathland, which split into dry heathland or dry montane heathland. And then we've got bog and wet heath, which is then split into blanket bog, raised bog, and wet heath. Now, this is definitely habitats that I struggle to know the difference with, so I would need to definitely research this one a bit. Then we've got marsh and fen, another bit of a tricky one. So we've got acidic fens, flushes, mires and springs, and then base-rich fens, flushes, mires and springs. So as you can imagine, if you're talking acidic or base-rich, that's going to affect the floristic community that's present. So again, that the species that are there should give you an indication as to which one you've got. Again, we've got training again this year on these specific habitats with Ben Averis delivering them, so they should be excellent. And then freshwater habitats. So we're looking at nutrient poor lakes and ponds, nutrient rich lakes and ponds, and rivers and streams. And canals are also in this as well, which it mentions in the guidance notes. We're going to have some training on freshwater habitats this year by a new trainer called Sue Bell, who's a freshwater ecologist. So that's something to look forward to later on in the season. Then we've got rock outcrops, cliffs and screes, which is inland rocks and scree, montane rocks and scree. And then coastal, so not so relevant for the Chilterns. But if anyone is interested, we are also having training on this year. So we've got Ben Averis delivering coastal training for us as well.
I guess so. So sorry to jump in there. For us, really, we're boiling it down to not rule out every square, but essentially we're going to be looking at arable margins, the woodland options, and then the grassland, aren't we, really, in the Chilterns?
Yes, yeah.
Some of the squares may be lucky they might border one of the chalk streams or a brook or a ditch, but against it, we're boiling down to those three, aren't we? So
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Which in a way is useful because then you can concentrate your efforts on those. The difficult thing is that grasslands can be a particularly tricky set to get your head round. So it's worth, I'm going to be doing another set of training videos this year on classes for grasses. So we're going to be looking specifically at grass species. So if anyone's interested,
brilliant.
They can catch that as well.
So and while you're on the training, a couple of questions in the chat come up about these additional training courses you've been speaking about.
Yeah.
Because the volunteers or everyone on the group aren't signed up technically to MPMS.
Oh, it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Yeah, they can come.
Would you be able to let me know or find out? We find out when they're on, so I can.
Yeah. It's all. They're all up on the MPMS website already.
Ready they're already there, are they?
Yeah, okay. Already up there. Again, as I say, because they're webinar styles, we can have up to 500 people. So we're not concerned that people aren't registered as National Plant Monitoring Scheme volunteers. So it can be anyone that's got an interest. Or like yourselves are in part of another scheme. So
that's brilliant. In the break, I'll try and find the link and put it on the chat then. Yeah, great.
Yeah, that'd be good.
Thanks, sir.
So this is just to show you the species list booklet that you get. So as you can see, we've got the list of scientific name, and it is in alphabetical order based on scientific name down here. We've then got the common name. Then the first box, which says WF, so that is to indicate if there's a symbol in it, it means that you record it at wildflower level. If there isn't a symbol in it, you don't need to worry about it. However, all of the rest of them are basically your indicator level, so you need to survey them. And the page number refers to the guidebook, identification book, and about which fine habitat it might also appear in as well.
Sarah, can we get copies? There's questions, sorry, Jan's asked in the chat, to save people's printers. I know when we first started, these are printed up as booklets, aren't they, for MPMS volunteer. Is there a way that we could get hold of them or buy them from you to then send out? So quite often, if it's got a printed version, It's a lot easier than.
Yeah, of course. I'll speak with my colleagues at Plantlife about the logistics of financial implications for sending out additional booklets, but I can't see a problem with that.
We can buy 50
Yeah.
copies. That'll be that saves a lot of, and then it's a lot easier in hand. You can put it in your rucksack and.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. If you could, that'd be great. Thanks.
Yeah. I mean, at the moment, all of our volunteers that have signed up as part of the national scheme since beginning of January haven't had anything in hard copy either, because I'm not allowed in the office. So everyone's only had the digital version at the moment. So yeah, I've got about 1 billion postage things to organise when I get back.
Well, you can do all that. Don't worry, individually. I could send them on to me, and I can send them out.
Yeah.
But yeah, if that's
great.
Thanks.
Fine. Okay. So in terms of if you're worried about learning species ID, obviously, as I've mentioned, we've got the species identification guide, which is quite a useful little booklet, actually. I was having a bit more of a flick through earlier. So unlike most of the normal wildflower guides, it's not arranged in evolutionary order, which is what most of your guidebooks will be. You'll have things like the buttercups and stuff first, because they're the early evolutionary species, and it will go further up, and then you've got orchids at the end, which are further later in evolutionary terms. This guidebook is arranged into flower colour, so you basically look at the side of the page and see what colour it is, and that will be the indication of what flower you need. Obviously, a lot of people have the Francis Rose wildflower key. I have that as well. Any other guidebooks, you're more than welcome to use as well. The SBI website is incredibly useful as a resource. So it's got loads of links to individual species and how to identify them. There are lots of other organisations with training videos or other useful online tips as well. Obviously, someone like the Field Studies Council, when things are back up and running, they provide excellent courses. I've done several myself. But you may even find that the local wildlife trust is running certain events as well, so it's worth checking those out. So this is just to give you a little show of the form itself. So you can see here that it's really important that you tick which level that you're surveying at when you're out there, whether it's the wildflower indicator or inventory. You want to make sure you put your date of the survey, and obviously you've got your space here for the date of this, whether it's the second survey. You've got your 1 kilometre square grid reference, and then you've got your plot grid reference details as well. And then it asks you for broad habitat and fine habitat, whether your plot is on a slope, how steep is the plot, management description. So is it being grazed? Is it a woodland that's being coppiced? Anything that you can note there. Obviously, if you're looking at grazing, it wants to know how intense that grazing is. So your guidance notes give you a little bit more detail on that, and which animals graze it. I mean, it's worth remembering that something like rabbits are also included in this. So if you know that there's no actual livestock on the land, but it's definitely short turf, then it's probably that there's rabbits along the edge coming out and having a nibble. How wooded is your plot? I mean, most of these are fairly self-explanatory. So is there dense tree and shrub cover or not? And then vegetation height, I'll go into a little bit more about that in a minute. And then at the bottom, you've got a space for additional comments. So you can leave that blank if there's nothing to add, but if you think there's something significant, do put it in.
And Sarah, essentially, all of these forms mirror the questions that you're asked on Plant Portal, aren't they? So if you've got it on the form, it should be just an easy transfer into Plant Portal. So there's nothing. Yeah, they directly replicate each other.
Exactly, directly replicated. So it should be fairly simple. So on the back, we've got your plot sketch that you want to sort of draw while you're there. And then you've got a little bar to show you how to work out your domain levels, sorry. And then you've got your space to actually write your species in for first visit and the second visit there.
Just sorry, Sarah, for the
domain.
Oh, you're about to do it now.
Yeah. No worries. I definitely feel like this is something that needs covering. So here you can see you've got the percentage cover along the bottom. So it's obviously got a range. So using the relevant species list for each of the levels and of your habitat type, you search your plot and see what species are present. Maybe it's worth starting in one corner and then gradually moving out to the rest of the square. And remember, try not to trample the plants too much, otherwise you won't be able to see what's there. Regarding noting the domain scale, which sounds really scary, but it isn't, it's simply a way of estimating the amount of ground each species takes up as a percentage of the total area of the plot. Don't forget the leaves, it's not just the flowers. And remember to look beneath the larger plants in case there are some hiding beneath them, because remember, plants grow in layers. So basically you just look at whether there's sort of, I don't know, you think there might be 5%, or I don't know, middle of that, 7% you think, and then you can give that a level of 4. But I'm just going to go into even more detail from the next one here. So basically, I've tried to break this down looking at Domin scale. If you can imagine that this part, as you can imagine, sorry, this part is rather subjective, but as long as you're consistent across all your survey sites, then try not to worry if your version of 5% is more like someone else's 15. However, as you can see, each score is within a range of percentages, allowing for some variability. I've used this image of a gorgeous meadow that's near me as if it is your square plot and you are looking down at it. If you imagine that all the rough hawk bits, they're the yellow ones, were all squished together, but remembering to include the leaves, so it's not just the yellow flowers, then you estimate what percentage of the square that would take up. Now, the species mix here isn't huge, as it's fairly dominated by the 3 species, salad bonnet, rough hawkbit, and oxeye daisy, with some small numbers of fairy flax in there. You may well have been seen other individuals or several, there might have been other species there, but I can't really see them in the photo and I can't really remember off the top of my head. So I'm just focusing on these 4. So it's important to remember that you don't have to get to 100% across your scores. Firstly, there's going to be areas of bare ground, etc., but also the species are not all present in the same plane, so they are in levels of structure and height. So the guidance notes suggest you imagine or even bring a square that is 50 centimetres by 50 centimetres, as this represents 1% of the 5 by 5 metre square. So if you had enough of one species that it would fit into more than one of these size squares, but no more than 4, then, for example, you have a score of 3. This technique, however, is something you will just get better and more confident at with time. So that's definitely my biggest piece of advice would be, do not worry too much that you feel that you're not getting the percentages right first time. This will be something that you settle into and you just get better and better at judging. Okay. So then additional survey information on the form. So regarding aspect and slope, if the plot occurs on a slope, record the main direction that the slope is facing from the normal compass range, for example, north or northeast, and then try to record the main slope angle. So flat is 0 to 5%, moderate is 6 to 30%, and steep is over 30%. Management is sometimes very obvious and at other times not so much. So are there livestock, evidence of ditch clearance, hedge cutting, coppicing, etc.? If there is evidence of grazing, how intense is it? High, which would be very short vegetation with no real stems of any plants, lots of dung, etc. Or is it moderate, which is evidence of grazing, but vegetation height is variable with a mix of taller and shorter areas? Or is the grazing low, which is evidence of much reduced with most vegetation quite tall? And then you just give a Domin scale for bare soil, etc. And you give a score for each based on your estimate. So what is the vegetation height? So these extra parts of the recording process are just all ways that help with data interpretation for later on. So there are height classes for the vegetation. In a woodland, it's important that this measure is for the ground and shrub layers only, not for the canopy as a whole. And basically, this is a little bit of a list of what you might need in your backpack with you. So you're going to have your survey form, your guidance notes, and your species list to refer to. You're most likely going to have a map, or you just might be using the app on your phone. You might have your clipboard and your pencils. You might have tape measure or your string. You've got your plot corner markers, whatever you want, bamboo canes like I did, tent pegs, whatever. You've got your ID guides. You might want your hand lens, which is for looking at some of the closer features on plants. As you can see from my picture, that's looking at yellow sedge a bit closer up. You might have a compass if you want, or again, most phones have that on them. You might have a GPS device or your phone, or a camera or your phone. As you get the idea, most phones actually seem to have most of these features already covered. And worth remembering to consider health and safety. So this is obviously particularly important as we really want you to stay safe above all else. So what we would say is, and I'm sure Nick would agree, please do not survey large bodies of water alone if possible, and obviously don't try and get in to see what that plant is that's just out of reach. It's just not worth it at the end of the day when it's a plant. Make sure that someone knows where you are and how long you're expected to take, and maybe where your car is parked. Maybe have an arrangement with someone to let them know when you arrive on site and when you are leaving, and have a strategy in place for them to call you if they've not received notification from you after a set amount of time, and what to do next if they haven't heard from you. Do they call emergency contacts or consider further help? And obviously in these days of the pandemic, obviously keep in mind social distancing, maybe have hand sanitizer with you, etc. So obviously we're going to go on to specifics of submitting your data after the break, but obviously you're very lucky in that you can use the bespoke Tracking the Impact Plant portal page where you can have your own personal volunteer account, and we're obviously going to do the further training on that in a bit. So ways to find support. So your survey packs should really give you all the answers you need, but otherwise you can obviously contact Nick. The website is an absolute wealth of resources. So on here, as you can see, you've got all the forms and everything all downloadable as well. You've got the plot grid reference crib that I was talking about. There's a section on FAQs, which will be really helpful. And there's an overview presentation as well on this whole methodology as well. There's the access letters and all sorts of things. And there's also some habitat and species links there for some species ID stuff as well. So obviously, normally we would run face-to-face MPMS training, but we've got all of our webinars that you can come to this time instead. Maybe you could organise some online virtual meetups with other volunteers so you guys can exchange, sort of survey techniques, etc. And obviously, given hopefully the COVID situation easing, maybe meeting up in the field. But yeah, as I said, all of those webinars are free for you to come along to as well. And that is where we finish for this section, Nick.
Data entry side of things in a sec, but I guess time now for any questions on the first half of the session on the methodology and anything else that we picked up. Conscious that some of you on the call have had a go at this last year. Some of you are fresh in, so any kind of issues or things that popped up last time around, feel free to ask, or anything that's not sure from the first thing. To kick us off, Colin, you put a question in the chat around horse pastures. Do you want to unmute and kick us off, and then we'll open up from there? Yeah.
Most of the open fields in my square, there's limited number, are horse pastures, which are, 2 or 3 horses in them and cropped pretty much to within an inch of their lives. It's a question really as to whether they should, there should be a sample point in those, as they're recognisably different habitat from some of the others on the site, even though they're kind of well farmed.
I guess, Colin, my question for you regarding your square is, was any MPMS habitat clearly labelled on your square to begin with?
Well, only the woodland ones.
The woodland, okay.
There's a sort of an other habitat shading which covers
everything else. Yeah.
Everything else.
So I would say, with regards to any of that sort of grassland areas, if you can find a pre-numbered plot location that falls within that, you can definitely include the horse grazed pasture, and it would again come under probably neutral pastures and meadows. Obviously you're going to be noting that it's highly intensively grazed, and you'll probably get very few species to record at indicator level. However, from my previous experience as a wildlife surveyor at many botanical sites, some horse grazed pastures, basically the species are there, but they're just being eaten away. But basically, if you were to take those animals off that site and change the management, then actually you'd get a much more interesting floristic diversity coming back. It's purely that the intensive management is what's holding it back. So in terms of the habitat type, you don't necessarily have to exclude it just because of the management that's currently on it. What I would say though is maybe you've got cattle grazed grasslands that are actually, they're not semi-natural because they've been sown with a grass mix and highly sort of fertilized and things like that. That's probably less likely to come under the same category. But horse grazed pastures often haven't had that same level of intensification over the years. Obviously, they've had fertilizer in the form of the horse poo. But again, it's all about the fact that we're not getting you to look for areas within your squares of really interesting habitat to sort of, you know, find out all these amazing species. It's purely for a monitoring point of view. And we want you to look for NPMS habitat and go with that at the first and foremost. But if you're like Colin, who's only got woodland, then you would look at your numbered plots and figure out where else you should put them based on what falls within NPMS habitat and what doesn't. But that would be fine. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And Sarah, you've already answered Colin's question about ponds, but maybe if you're happy to, I'm not sure if everyone's seen your answer in the chat, but you're okay to pick that one up. Thanks.
Yeah, so in the guidance notes, it does explain that ponds are often a feature that actually we try and get you to look out for, and flushes, which I'm going to answer the question about the flush in a minute as well. But it can be that, yeah, you haven't got, maybe you've got like quite an arable plot. I had a lady on the phone the other day who we had a look at her square, and she was a bit sort of dismayed because it was all arable and very little of anything else. But actually, when you looked at the Google Maps, we realized there were quite a few ponds within her square, and they would be worth selecting. Now, obviously, that comes under the self-selecting the plot because the pond is where it is, and you can't necessarily line up the numbering with that. It's interesting to know that you should record your ponds as a linear habitat, which basically means you're going all the way around the edge. You want to be surveying from where the water level normally is 1 meter into the water level. So therefore you're recording those marginal species that are right on the water's edge to any actual aquatic emergent species that are in the water. Again, don't get in, obviously, to check those. But what we're not trying to do is say the grassy, vegetative, vergy bit that's all around. I mean, if you have, say, an arable pond that's maybe an old marl pit or something, you're probably going to find that there isn't much vegetation and it's mostly duckweed, and that's all. But again, you can just monitor that as time goes on. And when you say, Colin, about the fact that it obviously shrinks, the water level shrinks in the summer, again, you just would be surveying from where the water level normally is when the water is okay to 1 meter in. So it might be that actually that's quite a lot of mud with some sort of crowfoots or whatever along that muddy edge.
Yeah, being on chalk, yeah, it's kind of, most of the ponds, if they exist, fluctuate quite widely in height, and also they tend to be a bit sort of I can only think of the word grotty, to use the technical term.
I mean, obviously, if you've got a beautiful square with lots and lots of NPMS habitat choices, don't go for the grotty pond, as Colin puts it. But if you're struggling to find NPMS habitat within your square and you have got some ponds, then that is an option for you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and then while we're on that, I just answer the question about what is a flush, other than the noise when you go to the toilet. So a flush basically is an area of boggy ground that's usually on a slope below a spring or next to a small watercourse. They're fed by groundwater that isn't confined to a channel, and therefore often permanently wet or soggy with a covering of mosses, and usually only sparse cover of wildflowers, grasses and sedges. Flushes often grade imperceptibly into larger mires, marshes, swamps on level ground. So an example of a flush would be that if you had a lovely meadow, say, with sort of a very damp, wet bit coming from the top all the way down, and the centre bit is probably the flush, basically, where it's very damp and wet.
Right, thanks, Sarah. So I have to open out now. If anybody has any other questions, I'm conscious. Jan, if you're still on the call, and one or two others who had to go at this last year, anything that kind of popped up that you wanted clarifying, or any questions, basically? Yeah.
Francis?
Yeah.
Can I ask just about the locating of the square? I guess if you've got one already allocated to you, it's you start off with working out the grid reference, and then you can use that to allocate it on the ground, and sort of work 2.5 meters out from that central point to get the edges, as it were. And then if you're allocating your own, then you would choose a corner of where you think your square or strip is going to be, take the GPS of that, and then work out from there.
So yeah, so this is, so if you're having to self-select your plot, basically, you've got your meadow, you've chosen the most. I'm using meadow just because it's most likely to come up. You've chosen your area that is the most representative of that habitat type, and then you would basically start in what you would define the southwest corner of your plot, take your grid reference from that point, and then you would do your markers in the direction from that point. I would say that you're right with that, Francis.
Right, and then I mean, how straightforward is it then to come back later?
So that's that's the key. So a lot of tips are, as I was saying, if you make sure that you set up your plot in a sort of rotation that makes sense with the landscape that you're in. So if you had a fence line, for example, have it so that it's in line with the fence line rather than off at an angle, because that's going to be difficult. And to the point where you could even measure the distance or pace it out from the southwest corner to the fence line, and make a note of that on your sketch map, for example, and say, it is, I don't know, 5 meters from, and then on your sketch map, that's where you can put in if there's a particular tree stump, or that's where the gate is, that all of that sort of detailed information. And the photo that you take from that southwest corner will always be from that angle, so you will be able to help to use that to frame where you are as well.
And is there a particular GPS app which you think is easiest? Any? Doesn't matter.
I mean, there are literally, if you go into your app shop, so to speak, whether you're Android or Apple, and just type in grid reference finder, then something will come up. I have one that is called literally Grid Reference Free OS. Also, it's worth noting that if you subscribe to Ordnance Survey Maps app, that will give you an accurate grid reference as well. But the one that I have, if everyone can see this, basically it gives you as accurate as a grid reference as your phone can get for the point that you're standing in. So if you can imagine that I'm standing in a field and I've already got a number written down for the grid reference I'm trying to find, I simply walk and move about until I get the grid reference that I need, that is as close to it as possible. Yeah. Because obviously that is a a very detailed grid reference. So yeah, but if you have a GPS device, then that's going to give you an even more accurate.
Yeah, if it helps, Francis, I've got one that's called GPS OS grid reference. It might be the same one, but it looked different on the screen. I don't know if anyone can see that. I'll turn my camera. Anyone see that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's free. It said it goes down to 5 meter accuracy, so you probably won't be short of free ones on the App Store, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question? Because I was a pioneer last year. But
well done, Jan.
I didn't have the benefit of such a detailed briefing, so I didn't know about the bisecting lines when setting up the plots. Am I better to start again or to go back to the one I did last year?
I would say definitely just stick with the ones you've got and don't worry about that too much. That's fine. I think the consistency is key, really.
Okay, thank you very much.
No worries.
And a question, Sarah, about start date. So in theory, 1st of April is what, 4 days away, 5 days away?
Well, I mean, I get this. Yeah, I get this question a lot about start dates, but
yeah.
I mean, ultimately, all we're looking for is 2 survey times, one in late spring, early summer. So whenever you define that, and one again in late summer. Now, if you happen to have quite a lot of woodland in your square, then any time sort of into April, May is going to be a great time for the woodland survey. If you've got grassland, however, if you go in April, 1st of April to a grassland, you're probably not going to find an awful lot. Yeah. So I would say there's no strict dates at all. It's just make sure that you do twice a year. And you don't, a lot of people ask us, does it need to be the same date? Not at all. So all of these elements are taken in when considering the statistical analysis of the data. So you know, it's not something you need to worry too much about. Whenever is good for you, as long as it's one then and one then.
Okay, that's kind of, because from a breeding bird perspective, breeding bird survey perspective, it doesn't matter where, I guess, when you go, but the guidance is to try and go within a couple of days either way every year, so you're consistent. But I guess that's more you're picking up migrant arrival dates and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So if you went 10th of April this year and the 23rd of May next year, it wouldn't matter from an MPMS. But okay.
No.
Yeah. Okay.
Fine.
But give yourself a chance, I guess, when things are out.
Yes, exactly.
Make your life easier. Yeah.
No, because not all of us really enjoy using Poland's vegetative key ID for grasses. So, you know, don't go and do grassland when there's nothing there. It'll be miserable.
Exactly. Good stuff. Any other questions before we move on to data side of things? It's nailed everything then, Sarah. In which case, should we crack on? Are you okay to go to the second half? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, so obviously, if you have any questions, as before, we can just go through them as they come up. I'm happy to do that. And apologies that this is probably going to seem a bit drier than the other one with less pictures, I'm afraid. This might be the last one because it's, oh no, we've got one more. So this is going to give you an outline of what we're hoping to cover in the session. So we're going to be looking at the Plant Portal website in general, how to navigate it, create an account or edit an existing one, and looking at creating plots, viewing plots and squares, and then on to entering data. So we're going back to this map again, just to show you all the plots. So this is just to give you the overall view of all the squares that have been placed for the tracking in the impact project. These are specific squares to the project, unlike the national MPMS squares that cover the whole of the UK, which are generally at a much lower density than this. But the idea for the Tracking the Impact project is that you are adopting the MPMS methodology in order to monitor and track changes in plant communities across the project area, with hopefully a wealth of long-term monitoring data to explore in the future. We are hoping that more projects and organisations see the value in adopting the methodology for monitoring work, so that when it comes to survey methods, we can get everyone singing off the same hymn sheet, so to speak. So the aim of today, though, is to run through, or this afternoon's session, is it this afternoon? No, still got 15 minutes, is to run through the Plant Portal for the Chiltern volunteers. So we're looking at the different functionality and the data processes to help make the most of your experience, and importantly, ensure the valuable data that you're collecting reaches the project to be analysed. So as a disclaimer, as I said, this is part of the course is a little bit drier than the species or habitat training, with no lovely botanical images, but rather containing site visuals and instructions. But the aim is to introduce you to the portal so that you'll be confident using it and provide another support tool for your reference when using it. So yeah, as you can see, so this is the home page and what it'll look like. So you can navigate everywhere from the menu bar at the top of the page. It's worth remembering that the Plant Portal is still evolving as a website, and some of the, not the functionality, but some of the viewpoints and just some of the features of it might change over time to look a little bit more user-friendly or a bit more engaging, but it's a work in progress. And of course, you need to log in, which is the important part. So once that you've obviously already created an account, then you can obviously just click on the login. So that just has a place where you can put in your email address and password before clicking on the login button. However, if you haven't created an account, then you will need to select the create a new account to get started. Or if you've forgotten your password, which let's face it, happens to us all at some point, because we all have so many flipping passwords going around in our heads, it's no surprise that we occasionally forget them. So if we're looking at to create your account, so in order to create your account, you'll need to enter your email address and choose a username. So choose one that's memorable. There's then the option to upload a photo of yourself or a picture of a lovely plant if you wish. Then your first and last name and click create new account. Nick will then need to be contacted in order to assign your login to the Tracking the Impact project itself.
So just Sarah, just on that. So when you, because that's an important bit, because I need to open up, essentially give you permission, for want of a better phrase, to open up your square. So when you set up your account, if you can let me know that you've done it, and I can go in behind the scenes and click in, and then you'll be good to go.
Great.
So I need to work that through. And I think, Colin, you asked a question around same username and password as last year. Yes, if you can remember them.
Yes.
Once you've got the account set up, that's your account forever and a day then. So yeah.
Yeah. So we have a similar thing with the national scheme in that people can set up their account, no problem. But when they request a square, we have to approve it before they can actually carry on. So once your account has been created, you'll be able to log in, view your account, which you can see Joe Bloggs' account there, edit your account, and then log out when you've completed entering or viewing your data. So you just click on the little My Account and it will show you this data here with your first name, last name, and how long that you've been a member of the, well, how long your account has been there, basically. And if you want to edit your account, then you just come back into here. So you can change your password if you want. So say this isn't for if you've forgotten your password. This is obviously if you've already logged in, but maybe you realize that what you chose wasn't exactly memorable and you're like, oh no, I need to put something that I can write down and something that's going to sort of stick. Then you can go in and change it here. When you have forgotten your account, it's worth knowing that in your password, sorry, and you click on that, then you'll be sent an email about what to do about that, and it'll automatically help you to log back in again and set you a new password. So the bit that's really important in here is down at the bottom. There's a section that says locale settings and training, and the training mode sort of is really important. So I've ticked this bit on my account as I am obviously just playing around with it for training purposes. I'm not a Chilterns volunteer, so I'm not going to be entering data. But you must remember to uncheck this box in your account before you do start creating your plots and entering your data for real. So by all means, if you're new, do tick that part in your account settings and have a play with it. Work out how to set up plots and all of that, but then make sure that you go back into your account settings, edit, and untick that box. Otherwise, all of your hard work won't be remembered on your normal account. So now you're all set up. So all the other actions can be found under the Tracking the Impact menu bar at the top. And you can see you've got Explore Squares, Create Plot, Data Entry, My Visits. So the first thing that we're going to have a look at is how to explore the squares. So just like with lots and lots of maps, you can navigate using the up, down, left and right arrows to get to different parts, and using the zoom in bar, you just click the plus or the minus to zoom closer in to see where those squares actually are. And below the map is the list of all of the square names. So they've all got individual names with a grid reference ID, as you can see. So if we were to click on the view plots, that would then take us into, we've gone to Chalfont Grove. Is that, I think that was Colin's one, wasn't it?
It was indeed.
Yeah, I thought when you said it rang a bell because I'd gone in to look at it. So here you can see this has got the plots here. Now, if it's a square that hasn't had plots in it already, then that won't, none of this detail will be here. It will just say there's no information as yet because none have been set up. But obviously, because this one has, you can see that they're here with the centroid grid reference markings and a little notepad and pencil you can click on, which will let you view and make edits if you need to. There you go. So that's what it looks like once you've clicked on the little notepad and pencil. So you can see the plot on the map on the grid reference. It's a teeny tiny little red square there. And here you can make edits, add sketches or descriptions, for example. However, it's really, really, really important that you don't change the plot location or delete the plot once you've already entered data for it. So if you come in here and start sort of messing around with things, that's going to interfere with the data that you've already created and how it's linked to it. So if, for example, you've got your square and you want to go in and you want to create a plot, then you need to go back to the tracking the impact menu, drop down and select create plot. So this page is very similar to the one where you were viewing the plot from before. However, the information will all be missing and the map will be zoomed out like this. You select your square from the first drop down menu, then the plot type, so whether it's linear, square 5 by 5 or square 10 by 10, and then you add a name for the plot. This could be a name and a number, for example. And then there are a couple of environmental options about slope and direction to fill in. In terms of finding the location for the plot, you can either navigate using the map just as before, so zooming in to the exact location of where you want the plot to be and clicking on that location on the map. This will then auto-populate the grid reference box for that location. However, if you already know the grid reference location, as in like we were talking about before, maybe you've done your square recce, you know where your plot's going to be and you have that very detailed grid reference already, then you can type that straight in and then the map will zoom straight into that location for the plot. So once you've completed these stages, then you can click save and the plot will be saved and appear for that square. So then if you wanted to go in and enter some data for that plot, then you need to go back to the tracking the impact menu bar and select data entry from the drop down menu. This then takes you through 3 stages. So the first is for location. Select the square again from the drop down, then the plot from the second drop down. The spatial reference will then auto-populate and the map will then zoom into the plot location again. Again, no data can be entered until you have created these plots first. Yeah, just emphasizing that point. So next is the details of the survey. So you need to first choose your survey level from the drop-down menu, then enter the date of the survey, highly important. Then, and obviously you can see there's little red stars by the things that have to be filled in before you can carry on anyway. And then you need to select from the drop-down the broad scale habitat and then the fine scale habitat afterwards. And then you can simply check any of the boxes for the management types that are there. Again, this is all replicating the forms that you've already filled in the field. So further boxes to fill in regarding the management, which again replicate the survey forms, then the vegetation height and the surveyor name beneath that. And lastly, the drop-down sections for bare soil, leaf litter, etc. And if you leave them blank here if the answer is 0. You can then add your plot photo that you've taken from your southwest corner, which is hopefully the same angle that you've taken it from every year. So it would be interesting to look at those over time and add any additional comments that we talked about before. And then you click next step. Then you can start entering your species data. So in the box beneath species, you start typing the species name, and this can be the Latin or the common name. But as you type, the suggestions will appear beneath that you can click on. Remember to be cautious of subspecies that are listed here. Worth having your field guide next to you to double check you're not accidentally selecting a subspecies that is super duper rare, because they all are aggregated together and you don't want to accidentally click on one of those and get one of the recorders phoning you up and saying, oh my gosh, have you found this? And equally, you can see here, you can type in the common names and they will come underneath. So that's quite useful. And then for each species, you then need to add the abundance domain choice, which you will again have on your survey form already. And so you just need to drop down and select from the drop down menu. And then after you've entered all of your species and you put in the domain for all of your species, then you click save. Then if you want to see all of your survey data, so you're very proud, you've done your 2 visits and you think, oh, I just want to see it all on there. Then you can simply go back to the tracking the impact at the top option again and go down to my visits. This will show as a blue point on the map for the plots that you have entered data and a list of the plot data beneath the map. So you should be able to see a nice blue dot there, and underneath you can see that there's the plot written underneath. This is what it'll look like when you've entered data. So you can see under actions that you can select edit, which is useful. So maybe you forgot to add a species, or in fact, you've since realized one of your IDs was incorrect, and now you know what species it is, because we've all done that. Let's face it, we've all gone, oh yes, that's that, and you've entered it all on here, and then suddenly 2 weeks later, you see the same plant again, and you're, oh my gosh, I've put the wrong plant down. You can just go back in, edit, and change it in there. That's no problem. Sorry, just go back. Oh yeah, so it's just showing you the edit button. So now I'm going to attempt to stop sharing here and share the actual website, so we can actually live time see if we can do this. So this could be interesting. I'm sure I've done sharing a live video usage before. So let's just
and Sarah, just while you're trying to find the website, I guess in all this, a lot of the bulk of the work really, I guess, is set up, which you only ever do once. Once your square's set up and all your plots are there and your sketches are there and your pictures are up and they're named and labelled, they're there forever then.
Yeah.
So so you don't have to do this every year. So Jan, you've done all this. You can crack on now. We're just entering your records. So it feels like it's a bit of a thing to start with, I guess. But once it's there, it's done and dusted, and you're then going back in next year just to add your actual survey records. So because they're on your site.
So I can log out just for a second here. This is where then, oh yeah, there you go. So this is what it would look like before you've logged in. Welcome to the plant portal. So as you can see, it's probably the most boring looking website front page I think I've ever seen. But as I said, that is probably going to change. But they've obviously been focusing on functionality and usage rather than. So I've got that fancy thing where it remembers all of my details, which is really exciting. So I never have to remember passwords anymore, really. But obviously, if you didn't have this, then there's the section for create new account, which then you just put in your email address. Rather helpfully as well, it gives you a little box of exactly what you need. So here it gives you an indication of what sort of thing you should have as your username. You can choose your file to put a picture, first name, last name, and as you say, so if you wanted to start off by doing the training, then you just tick this box at the bottom there. So I will log in because I already have an account, which is it's Rachel Murphy's training account. I've just changed my name, otherwise it was just say Rachel Murphy on there. So and then when we're here, we can come to this tracking the impact and explore the squares. So as you can see, here you go. Now, rather frustratingly, you can't zoom in using your little wheel, so you have to use these. But it's quite easy then just to drag and explore some lovely areas here. And underneath, it will have all of the plots here. So if I wanted to view these plots, I just click on view plots. And don't worry, Colin, this test plot is, I'm under training mode, so it won't appear on your thing. But basically, you can just go in and view the test plot. I think this is one that Rachel did herself, actually. And here you can see all the information. So again, she just, that's just because I'm on training mode, that's fine. So there's the plot, you can see it. So she's called it test plot 3. You can obviously call whatever you want. You can put in your southwest corner grid reference there. Otherwise, you can zoom out on the plot. So just get a bit of a reference of where it is. And then you can zoom back in. And here we can add sketch. So there's already one in there. If you wanted to add another one, it would simply open this up and then you just go to your file where the sketch is and upload it. And the description says not a real plot, so that's exciting, isn't it? And then again, if we wanted to come back down here, we can just go back to exploring the squares again. And if we want to go back into the square and create a new plot, so we can say create plot, and then this is where we select Chaffont Grove. There you go. That's fine. and we want to, I don't know, we want to create a nice big woodland square here. We're going to call it test 4. Isn't that exciting? We don't have the southwest corner thing, but it doesn't matter at the moment, so it doesn't ask for it. How sloping is the plot? So probably let's go with flat for here, and let's just put in a random thing for here. And as you can see, we can either, so that at this point when you're creating your plot, this is when, if you've got that grid reference that you had off your phone, that's where you could literally type that in and it would take you to that. Otherwise, for the sake of the training, I am going to just navigate down to this little part here, and we're going to zoom in, clunky clunk clunk, and there we go. I've selected a tiny little plot there. That's my plot, and it's already auto-populated the grid reference, as you can see. And this is where I could then upload my sketch that I've done of it and my description, and then I can simply say submit. And then when we come back to explore the squares, back down to here, go back to view the plots, test 4 plot is there, as you can see. And at any point you can go back in and edit that by hovering over here, and make any changes to that plot that you want to. But then if I want to do some data entry, then we go to the data entry bit under here. So again, it always asks you for the square, so make sure you put that one in. And see, this is the only thing, is like you're not really sure which one. I think it was this bottom one. Anyway, we'll go with that one. Yes, I think that was it. And here we go. So we've selected the plot, everything's all filled in there, and we just simply say next step. So surveyor level, let's go indicator, because that's what you are, Colin. Let's put in today's date and habitat. So it was broadleaf woodland, hedges and scrub, and we're going to say it's dry deciduous woodland. Oh, I noticed a bit of coppicing. Oh, and a bit of tree planting as well while I was there. Well, there's no grazing pressure because we're in a wood, so that's not going to be relevant. So I can just leave blank for that.
Just Sarah, just on that point, it's a real detailed one in woodland. But would you put in if you could see evidence of a browse line for deer browse line, that kind of thing, or is it only managed grazing?
That's a good question, Nick. I think that was one I'd have to pose to Ollie, perhaps. But I mean, for example, if we've put coppicing down, then obviously deer browsing could be very relevant if it's a coppice managed woodland. Yep. So for the sake of that, let's put in that it's low and we think it's deer, and we say wooded, it's dense tree and shrub cover. So there you go. We've put that in for yep. that. And then we enter our, so how much of the vegetation falls within this category. So under 10 centimeters, well, let's say, give that number 2. This between 11 and 30 centimeters, we'll give that a 1. I mean, obviously I'm not making this up as I go along. And basically, if you have any that you don't want to, there isn't an answer for it, you can literally just put 0. So if there was no understory, that sort of thing. And remember, this isn't asking about the trees. So if I put 0 in the over 300 centimeters, it doesn't mean that there's no trees on the plot because it's a woodland. That would be more relevant if it was grassland or something. So put in the right name. So put your own name, presumably. And again, for here, just leave blank for 0. So if there's no bare soil, but there's probably quite, I'm in a woodland, there's going to be quite a lot of litter. Litter means leaf litter, vegetative litter, not cans of special brew that have been lying around, that sort of thing. So let's say 25%. Mosses and lichens probably got a good amount of that. We're in a wood after all. Going to put our photo in there, lovely wood. Let's, for the sake of argument, fill that in so everyone can see. So you literally just want to go to your relevant file where your photos are, and I think I've got a woodland. There you go. I put a picture of a wood in now. There you go. So that's, imagine that's taken from the southwest corner, and we put in some additional comments and we say next step. And now we're going to, and you can see here for the species records, basically if there was no indicator species observed because the site is heavily grazed and there's nothing there, you can tick that. Obviously it's not re-ranging. So let's say we found some ash is the tree. So literally we've got ash here, and we're going to say that ash, maybe there's saplings and adult trees, so we're going to say 50%, and we're going to say wild garlic, or is it going to be ramsons? So sometimes you might find that it doesn't. There you go, ramsons. So that's why I suppose sometimes if you're using the Latin names, you're more likely to get the results. Especially there's like species like cuckoo flower, which is known as lady's smock as well, and as cardamine pratensis, which is the Latin. So it might be that you have to try and remember which common name, or just look in your book, because that will have the Latin name and you can type that in. And I know one final species. So here, herb Bennett, which should be here, but it's also sometimes called other things. We've got several individuals of that, and then we just click save. I mean, obviously you'd probably have more species than that. And there's our little plot with our records. But oh dear, I've forgotten that actually I didn't mean Herb Bennett. I mean Herb Robert. So take you back into the beginning, go past all of this, next step. Oh dear, I didn't mean Herb Bennett. I mean Herb Robert. There we go. And then you can just save it. Oh, I've got to put in the thing, several individuals. Save. And there you go. And then if we want to go, oh, this automatically takes you to your My Visits page where you can see your plot there and all of your data. So any questions at this point while we're still on the website? Might be a good time to have a look.
Just having a quick look on the chat, Sarah, to see if anyone's coming. But by all means, if anybody's got to unmute yourself and ask a question. Oh.
Sorry, Colin, here again.
Yeah, you go, Colin. Yep.
Yeah, if you have entered a plant and you subsequently decide maybe let's say autumn visit, you think, oh no, it's different now, I can see the seed heads properly. If you change it, does it lose all your previous data, or can you just change the name?
Sorry, the name of the what? Say that again.
If you've entered a plant.
Oh, a plant, yeah.
Yeah, which has got data associated with it. If you then go back in and want to change the name of that plant, do you have to re-enter its data as well, or can you just change the name? So
if we go back into the edit here, so what I did just now was so it always takes you back to the beginning of all of that surveying, so we just want to get to the species part. So as you can see, I went in and changed Herb Robert was originally Herb Bennett.
Yeah.
So I've gone in and changed that, put in that it was several individuals, and it's got rid of Herb Bennett completely.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
If this is the second survey and you had Herb Bennett in the first one, you could obviously go in and change it, and it will change it then as well, because obviously the data is not going to be necessarily being analysed throughout the survey season itself. But by all means, you could add into the comments box that originally thought it was Herb Bennett, but actually subsequently I've realised that I was wrong, and I meant Herb Robert, and type that in, and then the surveyors, the data analysis can see all of that. So yeah, you can go in and change it, but equally you can make comments about things like that as well.
Mary, you had a question. Oh, sorry, Colin. Have you got a follow up to that?
Yeah. Just
can you
define
Mary?
species again?
Sorry?
I know there indicator level, but the indicator species, please. What does that mean exactly?
So basically within your the species list here, all of the ones that are under that habitat type. So if I just go to dry deciduous woodland, for example, we've got a list of about 30 species on this page for dry deciduous woodland. So all of those are what you would be looking for on the indicator level. Only the ones that have got a little a black flower symbol next to them are ones that you would record at the wildflower level. So there's about half of what you record at wildflower level. The reason that these species have been picked for dry deciduous woodland as an indicator is because they're relatively easy to identify, they are nationally widespread, and they give some indication, whether that be positive or negative, as to the status of the habitat type. So interestingly, you can see there is an actual column that's labeled indicator with a plus and a minus in it, and some people get confused by that, but that is simply telling you whether it's a positive indicator or a negative indicator for that species. Now, you don't have to worry about that for that habitat type. You don't need to worry whether it's a positive or a negative. It's purely out of interest. So we can have a look down the list here, and we've got cleavers, or Galium aperine, which is goose grass, sticky grass, whatever you want to call it. And that's been given as a negative indicator for dry deciduous woodland. That's because it's usually very associated with high nitrogen deposition, for example. We've also got ivy as a negative, and obviously rhododendron, because it's a non-native invasive species. But you don't need to worry about whether it's positive or negative. It's simply that this is the list of species for this habitat type that we want you to identify if it's present and make a note of. But only the ones that are on this list for indicator, only the ones with the little black flower on them for wildflower. And if you're doing it at inventory, all the species that are present. Does that?
Okay, thank you.
No worries.
And Marik, you wanted to?
Yes, I've got
Yeah.
two quick questions. I've got both an NMPS square and a tracking the impact square. So
Oh, you like to mix it up there, don't you?
No, I know, but I found NMPS first and then tracking the impact.
Ah, okay, yeah.
So would I go into the general website for the NMPS? I would just go to the normal section.
Yes, yes. So have you previously entered any of the data for the NPMS square on our website?
No.
Okay, well, we are running a data and entry webinar next month, I believe it is. It's all on the website on how to do that. So it's very, very similar to the plant portal. There's just a few tweaks that are slightly different. But if
you in the same way.
no, if you go, so I will show you if you like. Hang on one moment. I can show you quickly. It won't take a second.
But unfortunately, Mary, it will be one route in for your NPMS square,
Yeah.
and then
okay.
different route for your plant portal for tracking the impact, because they're essentially two separate entry systems. Yeah.
So here you can see that I'm on the National Plant Monitoring Scheme. So under menu, you would go to create plots and enter data. Then you basically select whichever level you're recording at. So you indicator or wildflower, which level are you recording at?
Indicator.
Indicator. Yeah. So you'd select that. It would then, obviously you've logged in at this point, and then it will take you to a similar style to the plant portal when my computer decides that it's had enough thinking time.
Yeah, that should be fine. That should go.
Okay. That's fine.
So another question, I mean, just generally, because this is the first year we're doing it, how long would you tend to spend on a plot?
Per plot. Well, so I haven't actually done my first survey of it yet. And when I normally do botanical surveys, I'm surveying an entire field and every single plant species within it. Within one plot, I would say it wouldn't take you, it very much depends on how long you need to identify those species. If you're pretty proficient and you know exactly what you're looking for, you could probably do one plot within, say, 20 minutes, half an hour, if that. If you need to sit down and key out species or take, have a bit longer, it's going to take you longer. When I've been entering some of the data for some of our volunteers, one thing I would note is that an entire square has got the same date on it for that whole, all of those plots. So it hasn't taken multiple days to do that square. So, you know, it doesn't take too long.
Okay. And my final question is, when you were going down, you seem to be able to see all the plots. So can you go into other people's plots?
I don't, that's a...
Yeah, that's a good question, Marek. So unlike the breeding bird survey and others, when we physically allocate you a square and only you can see that, on these we kind of allocate you into the plant portal, but you could go into anyone else's square and you could have a look and have a play. So I guess please don't on that, so that we didn't have that extra level of security to allocate your square only to you. So I guess it's a tip really just to make sure when you're selecting your square every time that you don't click on the one above or the one below by mistake and start entering it in for someone else. It's a bit of a clunk of the system really, but yeah, you could in theory go into other squares.
Yeah, so that's something you can't do in the NPMS website, because you'll only be able to see your plots for your assigned login for that, so you wouldn't be able to enter anyone else's. But yeah, that's worth bearing in mind for this specific project.
Okay.
So we'll carry on with questions. I'm just the last part of the presentation, I think I've just got to, it's just showing again back on that website where you can find the resources for, even though you're the Tracking the Impact project, you can still come in and use the resources under our website. So as I showed briefly when I showed that website, that's where you can click on the plus buttons and it will give you the subheadings. And as you can see, we've got news, blog, conservation and research, so you can see all of those things there. And that is where also under the training and events, that's where the online training is. And within that will be a link for the webinars as well. So this is the list of events that we're doing for training this year. So we've got some throughout the year, we've got the methodology, which obviously might detail a little bit more to do with specific NPMS with regards to some of the data parts of it, but it will talk about plot setup and surveying and things like that. But probably the most relevant thing to you guys is all of the habitat training opportunities throughout the year. So you can see we've got a huge amount, and the grassland ones are going to be of particular interest, I would have thought. So yeah, and then this is just showing you the so we Nick and I discussed about the sort of need to enter all your data by the end of October. So that's basically just giving you a bit of a detail on, you've got your plots, you've done all of that, then you carry out your surveys, and then you put your data into the plant portal, and then that's when the data analysis and everything happens from that point onwards. So it's just, that's the end of the presentation. So yeah, have we got any more questions? Oh,
yeah, Colin Bloxham has put, yeah, Colin, you had a question.
Yes, Nick, there are some training weekends spaced throughout the rest of this year as well. So I guess those complement what we're doing today, but I think I've got, is it 3 weekends that I put in the diary as a result of information sent out?
Yeah, it's a good question, Colin. So part of the Tracking the Impact project, there's obviously there's the surveying route, which is either direct into a square or the training that we're talking about today to pick up a square. But equally, there are quite a few volunteers who would like to survey in the future, but don't feel confident in their ID, whether it's birds, plants or butterflies. So the courses you're referring to, Colin, are species ID courses.
Yeah.
Which we've got two each, 2 for birds, 2 for plants, 2 for butterflies lined up. He says COVID allowing over the spring. So we're hoping they'll be out in the field sessions, and for birds and for butterflies backed up with an online session as well. So I need to do it. So they do complement. You don't have to go on it. It's there as a confidence boost, and we are going to be limited by numbers. Obviously, we can have out in the field. So I'll be sending details around in the next week or so on that. We've got to just work through the dates and COVID restrictions to not get too complicated. I think it's not to the middle of May till we can start go out in larger groups. So yeah. I'll reconfirm those once we've just really worked through, I guess, depending on what Boris says on Monday. Work those through and come back out to you. But yes, definitely, those courses will be available to you. But I say we'll have limited capacity, and I'll send more details out in the next week or so.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
And just to, I think, just to be clear about the, if you're recording at wildflower level, just to reiterate that in the species guide, if you're recording at wildflower level, I'm trying to show this in such a way that it works. It'll be only the ones that have the little black flower symbol next to them for the beginner level that you need to worry about. So, for example, here we've got, this is dry deciduous woodland. We've got wild garlic or ramsons, hazel, wood spurge, sticky grass, wood ruff, wood avens, ivy, holly, dog's mercury, yellow archangel. But there's not really any grasses or sedges so much, so that it doesn't ask you to work out that too much, but it'll only be the ones with the little black flower symbol. In the species ID guide that comes with the project, they will be indicated with a little flower symbol, if everyone can see that, next to the species. So that little flower symbol there means that it's one that you record at wildflower level only, like, well, and an indicator obviously, but you don't need to worry about ones without the little wildflower symbol. Hopefully that explains that bit. Oh, and if there's a question about, is there a particular field guide that I recommend? So if you want to substitute your field guide here, my personal favorite is the Collins Wildflower Guide here, which is the second edition, really important because the first edition has quite a few mistakes in it. But the key in this is brilliant. It also, especially if you're recording at indicator level or inventory, it has ferns and grasses and sedges and rushes in the book as well. So you don't need to take second ones with you. I just find the key in this very, very easy to use and really useful. The other one that is quite common that I showed you is the Francis Rose, which has also got a great key in it, but this one doesn't have grasses, sedges and ferns in it, so you'd have to use something separate for those. But those are my personal favourites anyway.
Mary, you've got your hand up again. Have you got a question?
Yeah, just a quick question. As the survey carries along, is there any way that we as volunteers can see some of the results, or are there going to be reports or something? I mean, you mentioned a report that's been issued after the first 5 years, but will there be sort of intermediate reports so that we can see what's happening?
That's one for you, Nick, I think.
It is, yeah, absolutely. That's the whole kind of point of this. I'm really keen to play back the results to you, not only to kind of share what you found, but also start to build those kind of trends. So we had planned on doing a workshop last October. We'll come together and we can play back all the results, which obviously COVID put paid to that. But yeah, so I'm not exactly sure when we'll do it, but at the back end of the season when we can play back what you've all found and bring bird, plant and butterfly surveyors together so you can look at what other species have found as well and do the various mapping. In time, we'd like this to become very similar to what you're describing really at the beginning of the session, Sarah, and this becomes then the kind of the trend analysis of what's happening to plants in the Chilterns, but that's quite a long way down the road. Mm-hmm. But very definitely, yeah, it'll be autumn, I say that loosely at the moment, but kind of October time, I guess, when we can hopefully all get in a village hall somewhere and just share what we've found and play that back. So
right.
I'll keep in touch with you over the summer on that one.
Thank you.
Anything else we haven't covered? I guarantee there'll be 1,000 things when you actually get started, but anything else that doesn't make sense when you get out there and do your first recce visits or you go into Plant Portal, then please let me know and give me a ring, drop me an email, whatever it is, and I'll do my best to find out or work you through it and help you get set up. So,
and as I said, there's those habitat webinars to attend. We're also going to be releasing lots of little mini series videos on methodology and habitat ID. Also, I'm going to be running a few Facebook Live sessions this summer whilst out in the field. So you can always join in with those and see what it's like to actually be out in the field. Because I think sometimes some of these things, the theory is brilliant, but seeing somebody else do it is invaluable. So we're trying in our best ways possible to make that something that you can access online that can give you that feeling of being out in the field with us.